morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. We would like to welcome you all in this session on managing carbon rich, linking science and policy and action. My name is Daniel Mordiarso. I'm with CIFOR, Center for International Forestry Research, based in Indonesia. Today is a kind of conversation between a number of countries and also a number of policy community and scientists. So we are trying to link between science and policy work in three different countries, namely Peru, Indonesia, and DRC. So we are privileged to have three speakers representing the policy community and two speakers representing the scientific community. This work has been privileged and enjoy the support from a number of colleagues and donors, namely USAID and IKI, to various projects that the scientists and policy community implemented in these respective countries. So I would like to invite Dr. Noel Gerwick from USAID to give his remark regarding the work that USAID is supported through the SWARM program, which is covering these countries that we are talking about. Noel, time is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Can you see my screen and can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. My name is Noel Gerwick. As Daniel said, I'm in the Natural Climate Solutions Division at USAID. And I've really been looking forward to this session on moving from research to policy action in managing carbon-rich peatlands. Partially because I really do have a love of wetlands, but also because the topic is so relevant to achieving the ambitious goals that world leaders, including the United States, have advanced in Glasgow. And because the collection of presenters who have graciously offered to share their thoughts here, I think really illustrates beautifully the kinds of partnerships that we need to develop and implement evidence-based and science-based policies to protect, manage, and restore tropical wetlands. I have the privilege of managing from the USAID side the Sustainable Wetlands Adaptation and Mitigation Program. Acronym is SWAMP. Everybody seems to like that acronym. And for those of you who are not familiar with SWAMP, it is a partnership between USAID, the Center for International Forestry Research, and the US Forest Service. Now, Daniel asked me to speak a bit about the donor's perspective, and I'm going to do that primarily through the lens of this program. As you might imagine, the type of work that the SWAMP team does says a lot about what we're going to be hearing about in this session and why it is so important. SWAMP's been running since 2011, so just over a decade now. And this first slide that you can see, it actually isn't from SWAMP at all, as you might have figured out by now. It's from a 1991 paper by Evel Gorham, in which he estimated carbon stocks in northern peatlands. And I'm showing you this slide because at the time, this was the closest thing we had to a global peatlands map. And there's no information about tropical peatlands on this map. It was a long time before we started to understand the distribution of peatlands in the tropics. And how can you manage peatlands or mangroves if you don't even know where they are? So this next slide illustrates one of SWAMP's successes, which was to produce a global map of tropical wetlands. And I imagine that you are familiar with it, some of you, and we are continuing to refine this map so that the institutions and the individuals dedicated to protecting, managing, and restoring these carbon-rich ecosystems have the information they are telling the research community that they need. There are a number of other types of information that countries need to include wetlands in their national reports and to develop plans for conserving or restoring wetlands as a strategy to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. And many countries have not had this information. I know we'll hear more about many of these during the session. I'm just going to preview a few of them here. So this next slide, SWAMP produced on the left a protocol to support partner countries to measure, monitor, and report on carbon stocks in mangroves. The original protocol, as I said, is on the left. That protocol was then codified in the 2013 supplemental IPCC guidance. And then that was further translated into a regional specific guidance document. This one for East Africa, shown here on the right. So I'm showing you this slide with pictures of covers of reports, and we need these reports to achieve the kind of action we all understand is needed. The other point that I know we all understand, but I also believe is worth highlighting, is the amount of time and effort it requires from both the scientists and the managers and the policymakers, both to create these reports in a format that is useful and also to use them. That engagement takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time, it takes time to build the relationships, to establish a dialogue, to maintain those relationships, the understanding, the trust. Everyone in this room here today could be spending their time and energy elsewhere, but you are here engaging. So, sometimes, this kind of science, I think, is intellectually quite stimulating just in its own right. And I'm speaking for myself here, revealing fundamental information like, the distribution of carbon in the tropics, creating a whole view of a large section of the planet. That's cool. Identifying how fire influences carbon stocks, really interesting. Understanding how land use change affects carbon stocks differently from one type of peatland to another, all the kinds of things that SWAMP has done, also really interesting. Those questions, those kinds of research questions, I think can be very appealing to people who are simply curious about how the planet works. Other aspects of this science, like developing protocols for estimating carbon stocks, are, for me at least, frankly, not so intellectually captivating. But all of this work is critical to solving the problem that motivates it. We need these science-based protocols so that countries can participate as part of a global community to manage greenhouse gas emissions and to rein in these emissions. So these partnerships between the research science community and the institutions and individuals central to evidence-based policy formation and implementation, they don't just occur by accident. This next slide is what we refer to as a logic model for SWAMP. And I don't want to go through the whole thing with you, but I do want to call your attention to just a few pieces of it. This banner at the top, what's the impact that we're trying to have with this program? We're trying to achieve enhanced wetland management in the countries where we work for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And if you look at the three pillars underneath that, one of them is research, but we also have a whole pillar on practice and a whole pillar on policy. And there are all kinds of elements that we need to address under each of these in order to achieve that impact. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Just as we are strategic in our work with SWAMP, we need to be strategic in our work as an agency, as a larger community. We are therefore writing a climate strategy right now at USAID. The draft was released at the COP for public review a few days ago. It is open for public comment through November 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just about 2 weeks from now. And this strategy includes, of course, our approach to natural climate solutions, which includes the kinds of ecosystems we're here talking about today. I encourage you to please take a look at this draft, submit your comments, help us make it stronger, and help us be as strategic and have as high impact as we can. So, I think I'll close there. I just want to offer, one additional thanks to the organizers and the presenters for advancing cooperation on the shared objective of identifying opportunities to protect, manage, and restore tropical wetlands, especially at larger scales. And by larger, I mean subnational, national, and global scales. And when I talk about cooperation, I'm referring both to cooperation between the different professional communities, the scientists, the managers, and policymakers, but also the cooperation between and among countries. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the representatives of different countries who are here today, and hopefully we will have some time at the end to exchange perspectives and think about how our experiences in these different countries inform each other. So thank you very much to Daniel and to all of the presenters, and over to you.
Thank you, Noel. And it's been very inspiring about how USAID is going ahead in the future and trying to engage a scientific community in order to help with those three pillars. I just want to underline that it's not only about science, but also relate that with the practitioners as well as policymakers. So, without a further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Thornstein Zuber, who is also already supporting the activities in Indonesia through IKI and CI, mainly related to policy aspect of this exercise, of this undertaking with regard to managing carbon-rich peatland and also mangrove. Um, Closer where, Mr. Jesus?
Yes, good morning, everybody who's here in the room, but also watching us today online. I'm very pleased to be able to speak today on the behalf of the International Climate Initiative, as already mentioned, and I will try to focus my intervention pretty much on the, let's say, overall perspective on how to better integrate science and policy dialogue, which plays a quite important role also as part of the International Climate Initiative already, which is funded by the Federal Ministry for the Environment of Germany. And the IKI, perhaps for those who are not that familiar with this funding instrument, is actually existing since 2008 and is pretty much focusing on funding climate and biodiversity projects in developing and emerging countries. And we have at the moment 4 focus areas within the IKI, which is mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, is adaptation to the impacts of climate change, it's conservation of natural carbon sinks such as forests, but also, of course, peatlands, where also the projects you just mentioned are, of course, fundamentally important, and the conservation of biodiversity in general. In the past 12 years, there have been over 700 projects with a financing volume of around 4.5 billion euros, not only, of course, focusing on biodiversity or natural carbon sinks, but also partly we have a very great set of actors, diversity of actors, around 180 implementing organizations. And the overall target of the IKI is to support a transformative change to a resilient, sustainable and climate neutral society. And I think you all will agree when I say that in all these IKI focus areas, a science and policy dialogue is actually crucial to be able to identify priorities of especially this implementation and the programming of those focus areas. But of course, the question is pretty much crucial, how to ensure this dialogue in these programs. I think one thing is pretty much for sure that science and scientific results are, of course, the basis of IKI, as science obviously is key to understand climate change and to come up with IKI-related policy and programs. But taking science only as the basis to design public climate funding instruments like the IKI is not really a dialogue. It's a good basis for decision-making, obviously, to integrate science and to install programs based on science, but this is not what I would call a policy or scientific dialogue. This is a bit more like a one-way that you refer to science, but you don't really install a dialogue. So let me underline that the IKI in general is not a program to fund research or to fund climate research, but to implement specific climate actions. But that doesn't mean that IKI funding and IKI projects are actually ignoring science, because there are a lot of IKI projects that translate, or at least try to translate, scientific research into specific programming in regions, in communities around the world. And for policymakers as well as for implementing organizations, scientific information should be crucial to ensure that, of course, there is an efficient decision-making, but also a sustainable programming in place when applying for climate financing, such as the IKI. And generating scientific information which is then integrated into climate programming or even in the best case, integrated into climate policy, is of course fundamentally important, but also this is still not a dialogue. It's just considering climate science for policy making. And it's obvious, at least in our point of view, that very often this integration of science into policy and programming is not necessarily the case, showcasing that, of course, besides other challenges, there is obviously a dialogue still missing in many of the programs, also including, to be very frank, in many of the ICI programs, and that there is a need for improved dialogue between science and between policymakers. And there are quite some challenges, I would say, when it comes to those dialogue processes between scientific experts on the one hand, policymakers, and implementing organizations. Because when we think about adapting to the potential effects of climate change, it is a very complex topic, obviously, and we are in the midst of a constantly changing process requiring continuous update of information, a regular update of actions and adaptation actions, mitigation actions by individuals, communities, governments, and international agencies. And in order to make actually informed decisions, policymakers will need timely information. They will need useful information about the possibility of what consequences of climate change might look like. And there needs to be information about availability of adaptation options. But there is a challenge, I would say, for the scientific community to provide this information in a way that it is really implemented in policy programs and also updated when needed. Very often, what I can see, and it was also discussed before the COP started, scientific experts are urged to present their results to policymakers, to point out their data, and to share their facts, assuming that this automatically would lead into programming or policy priorities, which actually often is not the case. And because I would say there is still a missing dialogue, or let's say even perhaps different languages, scientific stakeholders, policy stakeholders, and even implementing organizations are sometimes speaking. So what I see, what is crucial for a science policy dialogue, and what we are trying to integrate also within the ICI funding portfolio, is that there should be as good as possible policy-focused assessments and scientific presentations of information. There needs to be a broader dialogue between policymakers and but also implementing organizations and scientific stakeholders. So it's not necessarily only between a policy and science dialogue, it's between a policy, science, and implementing organization dialogue in a way. And there needs to be a constant exchange on relevant questions on how to integrate scientific information into policy and programming. But, and this is a big challenge, there needs to be an exchange as well, how to act based on scientific information that is sometimes not complete and is constantly changing. So although the ICI has not a focus on funding research projects, it is very much focusing on enabling exactly this kind of dialogue. And we are supporting, as it was already mentioned, climate and environmental dialogue with major emerging economies like in Indonesia, in China, but also in India. And in addition to policy advice, ICI projects assist specifically in the implementation and organization of high-level bilateral environmental forums, regional and international conferences, and also ICI projects try to implement capacity building measures for focus countries on how to integrate scientific information into their policy priorities. So within the ICI, we already have quite an interesting set of projects which specifically reach out to science and have a specific focus on research cooperation between those different communities. I checked it today that there is a funding volume already about 30 million euros of projects which are specifically dedicated to this kind of research cooperation. And I believe that this is not enough. So let me underline that we have to continue with this kind of programming, combining those different science, policy, but also practitioner dialogues. And at least for the ICI, I'm happy to say that we will definitely focus on this kind of cooperation also in the future. And this, and I will come to a close also now, just giving a little bit the overall policy perspective from the Federal Ministry of the Environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Thorsten. Your keywords about science policy dialogue. That's very important, and we look forward how that kind of approach is being implemented in Indonesia. A project which is implemented by CI Conservation International in collaboration with Indonesian government. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Medril Sam to share his views and also experience in implementing this with Conservation International. Medril, would you like to use the microphone here, or you want to just use it? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So if I are allowed to put off my maskers. Okay. Thank you very much, Pa Daniel, and colleagues here in Glasgow, and also colleagues who are watching us through the online system. So uh, I would like to share some experience for Indonesian case, in particular on the sustainable peatland management in the context of low carbon and climate resilience developments. Um, uh, I would like I would like to start my sharing experience that I would like to present some data first about what we have already experienced so far in the last 20 years. I think we have to acknowledge that we still have a lot of, our forest still has a lot of pressure since the last 20 years. And we, of course, we cannot just let our forest go, and we have to do something for this. And well, based on our evidence-based policy exercise, I would like to respond to Thorsten's statement before that. In Indonesia, basically the relationship between science and also policy decisions policy decision is actually very close, and we really use science as the basis for our policy decisions. And this is what one of the examples. We have already done some exercise, and we have already projected some forestry scenario if we don't do something with our forests. So in this exercise, we can see that about 17.2 million hectares will be lost between 2000 and 2045 if we don't do something with our forests. And this happened also. These situations, I mean, the pressures to our forests happens also in our peatland areas, the land covers areas on the top of our peatland actually receive a lot of pressure as well. As you can see in the chart, that see that from 2014 and 2015 we have our land covers declined quite significantly due to the forest fire at that time and peat fire as well. But after that, the government had done a lot of efforts to reduce the peatland degradations, and we see that I still remember at that time in 2015 we developed our peatland restoration agency, and we also push very hard that we try to prevent the peatland fires and also forest fire after 2015. And as you can see, the results, the peatland degradations and also land cover degradations on the top of peatland soil is quite significantly reduced after 2015. And here we can see that if we do something with our land covers, with our peatland area, then we can avoid the reductions of our peatland, and then we can also secure our peatland area as well. After 2015, as you can see, we've done a lot, and for 2020 to 2024, we have already set what we call low carbon development policies. And this low carbon development policy actually is the way of the Indonesian government to reach our ambitions in NDCs. And of course, to reach our NDC ambitions, peatland restoration is part of it. And as you can see here that we have set this low carbon development initiative as part of our national development priority. It's already included in our planning documents, and even the emission reduction has been set as the top national priority and also part of macroeconomic priority, because in the low carbon development context, we would like to see that any efforts to reduce emissions should be linked to our economic development as well. So we would like to see that emission intensity will not be declining as well. So in this case, as you can see, that we have Indonesian government set the peatland restoration policy as part of low carbon development and has been set as a national development priority. Of course, when we develop this, when we set this planning, science is the foundation of the analysis. So this is an evidence-based policy, and we can, if you can see in our planning document, it is very real that there is a lot of technical document to back up these planning documents. And this is one the important thing that I would like to raise, that when we look at the peatlands in the peatland context, we really would like to see that peatland is not just a peatland. Peatland has a link to other many factors. So that's why when we set our national policy with regards to peatland, we see that we see the peatland is in a more comprehensive manner, in a more systemic way. So as you can see in the charts, we try to combine, we try to analyze what sort of implications of peatland restorations to the economy, to the social aspect, and how then the social and economic aspect provide feedback to the behavior of the our peatland areas. So this is a kind of example of how then the government of Indonesia look at and try to resolve our peatlands issues. And we also try to include peatland as part of our net zero emission targets. This is just one of the examples that we, one of the scenario examples that we have already developed. Of course, this is still ongoing, and we still need to collaborate with other scientific and also with the local governments, with the provincial governments, and even with the private sectors in how then we can set the peatland targets into our net zero emission targets. And this scenario also will be included in our long-term development plans, which will be set next year. Our long-term development plan will be set for 2025 to 2045. 2045 is our 100 years of our independence year. Of course, when we set our national policies and we try to link with scientific approach as well, we cannot forget what kind of drivers that push this peatland degradations in our country. There have been several drivers that have been identified, and of course these drivers will be considered as major considerations when we exercise our policy scenario in the future. And as Pak Daniel mentions, we collaborate with CI, with also our wetland colleagues, and basically my office has already established a kind of a team, what we call the wetland teams. This is a team for wetland management strategy coordination teams, and basically our job right now is to prepare our roadmap for strengthening peatland and mangrove ecosystems. And this is a kind of reference. This will be the major reference for our long-term national development plans that will be set or initiated next year. So we really right now in the right time to prepare these documents, and of course we will be collaborating very closely with line ministries and also other stakeholders. And we have according to our initial exercise, we have already set some indicative targets. For example, the total peatland area rehabilitations and also the emissions reduction targeted, and including as well some aspect with regards to the biodiversities. Well, there will be a kind of comprehensive scenarios here that we are going to set, and of course, this will be contributed to our peatland improvement in the futures. Last but not least, I think we need to address as well the actors of peatland degradations, and so that's why we have to include all these actors of peatland degradation as part of our uh, uh, policy development exercise. And of course, government, private sectors, NGOs, public and communities should be included in our process when we prepare our roadmap and also our policy exercise next year. And key takeaways that I really would like to have from this event, of course, I would like to underline that again, peatland is not just a silo ecosystem. It relates to any other aspect, many other factors, and so that's why we have to consider this as part of the ecosystem component. Peatlands, of course, is one of the ecosystems in a bigger areas. So that's why when we intervene the peatlands, of course, we need to consider any other aspect. Socio-economic aspect, of course, is one of them, and we cannot just think about physical aspect of the peatland areas. And last but not least, I really would like to encourage strong collaborations and synergy among the institutions in Indonesia, and of course, with the international scientific community as well. We really would like to see your contributions, and also then to provide more complementary informations and data to improve our policy exercise that will be finalized this year or next year or very, very soon. And of course, I would like to underline here that this become a major reference for us as a planning ministry to prepare our long-term development plans. Thank you very much, Pak Daniel. I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Pak Medril, for very clear and provocative kind of plan. This is not only 5-10 years, but until 2045, how science is accommodated, not only for dialogue, but also for planning for longer term, especially on peatland in Indonesia. And we look forward to see how scientific community can contribute to that, especially in a very large country like Indonesia. The next speaker is someone from Peru, Dr. Gabriel Guihandra. Is he here or will he be in online? He is a former Minister of Environment of Peru, who is going to share with us about the new platform for policy and legal entities in Peru with regard to peatland. If he's not, maybe he can move to the next speaker from DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, JeanJacques Bambuta, who is going to share with us his experience in coordinating peatland work in, again, another big countries like DRC. Dr. Bambuta, floor is yours.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not the Bishop of Glasgow. I'm just JeanJacques Bambuta, who is working for the Ministry of Environment in DRC, and I'm in charge of peatland as the coordinator of peatland management unit. So the mission of my structure is to build, let's say, a kind of peatland policy. For this, we have to learn on what others are doing. When I'm saying others, I'm just thinking, for example, for Indonesia, and other colleagues. Alors, ça c'était juste du bluff. Maintenant, je vais revenir en français parce que ma présentation est en français. J'espère que vous allez aussi improver votre français comme nous apprenons aussi l'anglais dans ce genre de circonstances. Je voudrais donc, comme je vais revenir à cet endroit pour beaucoup de présentations, il se pourrait que certains éléments que je vais dire puissent se recouper dans les autres présentations. Mais le plus important pour moi, le message que vous devez retenir, c'est que nous, République démocratique du Congo, nous sommes conscients du fait que les tourbières, dans le contexte actuel de la lutte contre le changement climatique, sont en réalité une super solution basée sur la nature. Et dans ce contexte, nous avons le devoir historique de pouvoir conserver les tourbières à tout prix. Alors, ma présentation est en réalité conçue sous forme d'échange. Comme je vais revenir plusieurs fois, je ne voudrais pas vous embêter avec beaucoup de choses. Je vais aller droit au message très simple. Avant d'arriver à cette carte, aux cartes que j'ai projetées là, je voudrais vous donner une idée du contexte général dans lequel nous parlons des tourbières en République démocratique du Congo. Notre grande question en République démocratique du Congo se structure autour en fait des cartes que vous voyez là. La question que nous nous posons, où sont les tourbières de la RDC et qu'est-ce qu'elles représentent en termes de stock de carbone et quels sont les itinéraires possibles de valorisation de ces tourbières-là. Nous sommes en République démocratique du Congo, comme vous l'avez déjà appris, même à travers des lectures, c'est un pays qui est caractérisé par une interconnexion entre les ressources naturelles. Donc, là où vous avez des tourbières, il se pourrait qu'il y ait du pétrole ou d'autres ressources naturelles. Du coup, lorsque nous parlons de la conservation des tourbières, il va falloir bien identifier les itinéraires pour qu'on ne puisse pas léser une piste par rapport à une autre. J'en viens alors aux cartes que vous voyez là. La première carte, celle qui a beaucoup de couleurs, donc celle-ci, elle nous a été produite par nos collègues de Congo Pit qui vont revenir ici, je pense, demain ou cet après-midi. Alors là, nous avons des tourbières, nous avons la dispersion des tourbières dans ce que nous appelons le bassin central. Alors, pour la petite histoire, la République démocratique du Congo est un pays du bassin du Congo. Mais au sein de la République démocratique du Congo, il y a des provinces qui sont dans la zone que nous pouvons appeler le bassin central du Congo, donc de la RDC, et il y a d'autres provinces qui ne sont pas dans la zone du bassin central de la RDC. Et donc, la première carte de Congo Pit ne tient compte que des tourbières qui sont situées dans le bassin central. Nous avons d'autres tourbières qu'il va falloir cartographier et inventorier. C'est là où j'en viens à la carte qui est en bas ici, que vous avez déjà trouvé dehors. Donc derrière nous, cette carte qui a été produite par nos collègues de Gusmaï Center est derrière nous, donc nous pouvons nous en inspirer. Et là, nous trouvons qu'il y a des tourbières en République démocratique du Congo, non pas seulement dans la partie bassin central, mais nous avons des tourbières dans la partie de la mangrove, donc ça c'est notre connexion à l'océan, mais nous avons aussi des tourbières dans le plateau du Katanga et d'autres tourbières dans la partie qu'on pourra appeler la vallée du Rift. Et donc dans tout cela, il est important pour nous en tant que pays de pouvoir identifier toutes ces tourbières et de pouvoir le cartographier. C'est là où notre tâche devient délicate et compliquée. C'est là où nous pouvons regarder du côté de nos collègues de l'Indonésie en termes d'échange de compétences pour que nous puissions comprendre comment les autres ont procédé pour pouvoir cartographier leurs tourbières ou pour pouvoir les inventorier. Et donc, la cartographie est pour l'instant une activité très importante. La troisième carte que vous avez juste au coin là, c'est une carte qui montre en fait les zones humides de la République démocratique du Congo. Nous savons ici tous que toute zone humide n'est pas nécessairement tourbière, mais une tourbière est un écosystème de zones humides. Et donc là encore, il va falloir que nous puissions identifier des méthodologies qui feront en sorte que nous puissions arriver à une très bonne cartographie. Donc ça, c'est ce qui concerne la problématique de la cartographie. Maintenant, lorsque je regarde l'expérience de nos collègues de l'Indonésie, et ils ont déjà réussi à pouvoir identifier une politique sur les tourbières. Nous sommes encore au début. Nous regardons quelles sont les synergies qui peuvent être développées entre les pays. Qu'est-ce que nous pouvons tirer de l'expérience de l'Indonésie afin que nous aussi, dans l'élaboration de notre politique nationale de tourbières, que nous puissions arriver à une politique robuste. Et comme je le disais, le challenge en ce qui concerne la République démocratique du Congo, c'est de montrer l'importance de la conservation de cet écosystème dans la perspective de l'interconnectivité de ressources. Qu'à cela ne tienne, les tourbières de la République démocratique du Congo sont pour l'instant intactes parce qu'elles sont dans des zones d'accès difficiles et inondées. Mais nous n'allons pas attendre à ce que les tourbières soient attaquées pour que nous puissions avoir une politique de conservation. Donc dès maintenant, c'est là où pour nous, nous avons l'opportunité de pouvoir regarder vers ce que les autres ont fait. Là, quand je dis les autres, je pense essentiellement à l'Indonésie qui est, j'allais dire, notre maîtresse dans ce domaine de tourbières. Nous apprenons beaucoup de leur expérience. Donc il va falloir que nous puissions regarder comment ils ont identifié leur politique, quel est le degré d'implication des acteurs, que ce soit au niveau national, que ce soit au niveau provincial, mais aussi au niveau local, parce que les zones à tourbières, même si j'ai dit que ces tourbières ne sont pas attaquées pour ce qui concerne la République démocratique du Congo, mais dans certains cas, les communautés produisent déjà des moyens de subsistance dans les zones à tourbières, après les avoir par exemple asséchées. Cela, nous le constatons dans le périmètre d'une ville provinciale qu'on appelle Mbandaka. Dans une autre présentation que je ferai dans les heures qui viennent, je vais aborder ce cas. Et donc, il est important qu'on puisse regarder tous ces itinéraires. Maintenant, pour finir, je voudrais faire le lien entre la politique des tourbières et la science ou la technologie. Je pense qu'ici, depuis le premier jour, nous avons vu pas mal de scientifiques qui ont défilé pour pouvoir nous donner un certain nombre d'enseignements sur la technologie appropriée aux tourbières. Nous, en République démocratique du Congo, nous avons essentiellement besoin de ce genre d'enseignement parce que, comme vous le savez, déjà en termes de cartographie, on n'a pas une méthodologie unique. Il va falloir, vous voyez, quand vous observez toutes ces trois cartes, elles ont été produites à base de méthodologies différentes. Donc, pour nous, en tant que pays, nous avons la responsabilité de pouvoir superposer toutes ces cartes à travers une méthodologie bien réfléchie afin que nous puissions avoir et obtenir quelque chose qui puisse marcher. Donc, là, la technologie qui pourrait exister, qui pourrait déjà être exploitée par exemple du côté de l'Indonésie, pourra servir aussi la République démocratique du Congo. Voilà donc, mesdames et messieurs, les quelques connexions que nous pouvons faire à ce stade. Et donc, comme je l'avais dit, il y a d'autres présentations sur lesquelles je vais revenir pour pouvoir aborder d'autres éléments que je ne peux pas aborder dans ce cadre. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Dr. Bambuta. Forgive me for my not only rusty French, but nothing. But I can see that we share the same concern between Indonesia and Congo, DRC, especially with that very charismatic Cuvette Central, where peatland is so wealthy in terms of its capacity in storing carbon. I think we can see here and that science is really needed in order to make a sound public policy with regard to what can we do with that very wealthy peatland in DRC. So we have heard two speakers talking about how introducing science in the policy processes. We would like to invite two speakers who is going to represent what they do in science arena in order to be able to help policy community and also practitioners to use this data numbers to plan and manage carbon-rich peatland properly. First, I would like to invite Dr. Haruni Krishnawati, who is also the coordinator of the International Tropical Peatland Center. So feel free to share about what ITPC is all about. Well, you are going to share your findings about fire emission factor, which is very important information to plan how low carbon development should be. Haruni, time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Daniel, for chairing this session. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Uh, First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks for CIFOR for as a host for inviting me at this session, managing carbon-rich peatlands from research to policy and actions. In this session, I would like to share about our recent study factoring and peat fire emissions. And I would like to also acknowledge my colleagues here who also joining or is part of our study. Uh, this is based on our joint research and collaboration from our research center with under the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Republic of Indonesia, and our colleagues from the University of Melbourne, Australia. Uh, I think uh, I think it's everyone know that the tropical peatlands is area of high carbon density that are important in biospheres and atmospheric interaction. And the dryness and burning of tropical peatland release about 5% of global greenhouse gas emission based on the previous study that has been published about 2011. However, fire emission is always a great uncertainty, especially from peat forest. And we identify some knowledge gap in the emission estimates, including the parameters that has been used in estimating emission from peat fires, and also how the effect of frequency of fire on emission parameters. And there is also the importance of pyrogenic carbon, which is maybe not many study has been conducted on this parameter. And uh, the most important thing also peat combustion factor, which the here in even in IPCC guidelines is always assumed to be completely combust and using 100% or one in this case. And I would like to share what our study has got the result. And we have conducted uh, reviewing the parameters which contributing to tropical peat fire emission estimate as per IPCC guidelines. Based on several previous study that we have been reviewing, there are actually not many studies which support fire emission parameters of equations in a comprehensive way. And also the majority of study report only based on field data, which is collected at least about more than 10 years ago. So this is kind of the background why we conduct this study to improve the emission parameters by conducting the field study to identify the difference in emission parameters amongst a range of peat forests which has been burned at different fire frequency. And here's some of the results. We see how the impact of fire frequency on above ground carbons. We conducted a comprehensive assessment of the above ground carbons, including live trees, ground vegetation, dead trees, horseworthy debris, and also litter. And we also conduct the assessment on pyrogenic carbons, how they been affected by recurring fires. We see that there's a great uncertainty in the estimates of peat fire emission, especially where peat swamp forest has been burned in more than one times. And our study saw that after one recent fire, it's about 30 milligram carbon per hectare remains on the above ground as the deadwood carbon pool. And following a second consecutive fire, about a half of the deadwoods is retained, mainly as coarsewoody debris or converted to pyrogenic carbon. Uh, Here, I would like to emphasize the role of pyrogenic carbon in emission estimates. Uh, Actually, not many study has estimate or the importance of pyrogenic carbon. But here in our field study, we see so many, pyrogenic carbon still left on the site after burning, which that's contribute to the carbon balance, and this also contributes to the emission. And we observed in one fire produced pyrogenic carbon, which is equivalent to about 3% of above carbon biomass. And that uh, repeated burning increase the contribution up to threefold. So um, pyrogenic carbon it becomes an increasingly important carbon pool in repeatedly burn pit swamp forests. And of course, ignoring fire produce pyrogenic carbon from carbon mass balance will lead to overestimation of atmospheric emission. So this is our study will fill the gaps of knowledge. And next, how we have improved the knowledge in terms of pit fire emission estimates. If you can see here, based on the graphs, the contribution of dead wood to pit fire emission so far, and based on our review study, is not actually properly accounted. And based on our study, the dead woods accounted for about 50 to 60% of above ground carbons, even in recently burned peat forests. And how about the pyrogenic carbons? We account about 12% of above ground carbon in repeatedly burned peat forests. So this is kind of carbon pools that need to be accounted for when we are estimating the impact of fire on emissions. And if you can see here, next, we have new combustion factor for peat swamp forests. If you learn about the IPCC guidelines or wetland supplement, the value of the combustion factor from peat forest is about 1, or they assume that about 100% all biomass will be completely combusted. But this is not, we didn't found the case in our study, and even in several years after fire. If you can see here on this graph, that's combustion factor actually increase with the depth of peat burns. So by improving this parameter and using this value, you can see that the estimates of emission resulted from peat fire will be will reduce about 30 to 40%. So this is the study that we would like to contribute to the development of knowledge and especially in improving the value from the country, from tropical peatland countries to contribute in the development of and improving the value in IPCC guidelines. And our study has proved that the combustion factor actually vary, and none is actually having one. So about 0.63 to 0.4, and this will reduce the emission estimate from peat fire about 30 to 40%. And how science on peatland fire actually can support the policy actions. As you can see in my review study, the knowledge on tropical peat fire emission has been widely available in recent years. And of course, data and experience in peatland management has been shared by our colleagues previously, also spread everywhere. And there's the need to gather available information and knowledge and develop further capacity to improve science-based action. So synergy is needed to provide right recommendation for policy action. And as has been introduced by Pak Daniel, that I'm also assigning to lead, coordinate the Secretariat of ITPC, International Tropical Peatland Centers. We are currently in the development of ITPC knowledge platform, how we would like to connect the knowledge and research to people. So we hope that the ITPC knowledge platform will be a go-to place for information on peatlands, and will provide space for users to browse, search, and also contribute to a variety of knowledge products. So welcome for all researcher, all academician, all practitioner who has knowledge on peatland could contribute to this platform. And here, just a brief illustration how the inter-platform and people interactions will be designed in the ITPC knowledge portal. And actually, there are two main users: knowledge user and knowledge providers. Of course, we are as scientists, a researcher, could be part of the knowledge providers, but we could also as part of the knowledge user, especially if we have some new knowledge coming and we can share, we can improve together. And of course, we would like to, in this session, to use this opportunity to invite knowledge data providers from our college here who joining us today to work together to make it all the works available in the publics under, of course, under agreed data sharing protocols. I think this all what I can share in this session, and thank you very much. And I would like to give back to Pak Daniel.
Thank you, Haruni. It's very clear message that if you don't use combustion factor properly, you very likely will be ending up with overestimation of your emission from fire. This is very, very interesting contribution of science to the policy community and also the reporting processes in the UN, FCCC, or whatever system where fire in peatland especially is involved. So thank you, and we also glad to be able to host the knowledge platform at CIFOR Hub, so that countries like Peru, DRC, and other interested in this information can visit that portal and share your data as well. So another speaker that we would like to have, and I would like to invite is someone from CIFOR, Christel Hergolach, who's been working very hard in Peru and Indonesia to look at another important aspect of calculating emission from peatland, especially drain peatland. Due to draining, is a lot of decomposition processes enhanced, so that the degradation is getting worse and causing emission in carbon and other greenhouse gases. So without further ado, I would like to invite Christelle to share her findings and experience working in Peru and Indonesia on emission factors.
Thank you, Daniel. Can you see well my screen? Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to participate to this key session on research to policy and action for a better management of carbon-rich peatlands. My talk will focus on peat greenhouse gases emission factors for the tropics, highlighting how these could be improved and discussing opportunities for science government interaction in peat greenhouse gas accounting. So tropical peatland play a prominent role as a global carbon pool with an estimated worldwide carbon stock of 350 gigatons in the soil, which excludes large carbon stocks in vegetation, especially in forests. In pristine peat swamp forests of Indonesia, they store about 200 tons of carbon in the phytomass and about 3 times as much per meter of peat. And so the tremendous amount of carbon stored in soils results from higher litter inputs than decay losses in anoxic conditions over the long term. Disturbances of peatlands, including activities such as logging of forests, drainage, or land use change, alter to different degrees their functions and systematically trigger high and long-term greenhouse gases emissions from the soil. Therefore, accurate accounting methods are very much needed. Almost a decade ago, the IPCC published a supplement on wetlands, which provided the first detailed greenhouse gases emission factors for peatlands in the tropics. And these emission factors were based essentially on data collected from Southeast Asia. Emissions of greenhouse gases from the soil arise from a range of activities and microbiological processes, which vary according to vegetation cover and environmental dynamics. And these figures shows well the complexity of the mechanisms underlying peat greenhouse gases emissions and the efforts needed to account for all of them. In this presentation, I will focus on peat decomposition emission factors for N2O and methane, which are circled in purple and green. And for CO2, I will consider the net decomposition loss referred to by the IPCC as the CO2 on-site emission factor, which is circled in blue. I will also include CO2 losses as dissolved carbon, which is circled in red. I will now present some results of peat greenhouse gases emissions in pristine swamp forests based on findings from Southeast Asia and Peru. This figure displays the 4 emission factors I earlier introduced, and their sum considering CO2 alone and all greenhouse gases together. As you can see, some of these fluxes are negative, which represents an uptake from the atmosphere to the soil, while others are positive and represent a loss. These results indicate that in Southeast Asia, the soil in pristine peat swamp forest acts on average as a CO2 sink, as well as a small greenhouse gas sink. In Peru, the soil in a palm swamp peatland located in northern Amazonia also acts as a CO2 sink. However, it is a net source of greenhouse gases due to the very large emissions of methane. In the next two slides, I will present the emission factors from the IPCC wetland supplement. After drainage and conversion, peat soils become very large sources of greenhouse gases, especially in land uses such as acacia plantations and annual croplands, including rice fields. The greenhouse gas budget is dominated by CO2, except in shallow drain systems such as sagopan plantations. And so what happens after reweighting a drain land? As you can see on the right side of the figure, the peat remains a source of greenhouse gases, according to assumptions, as we currently lack data. On-site CO2 emissions and nitrous oxide emissions were assumed to be zero by the IPCC, while dissolved carbon exports and methane emissions were assumed to be similar to levels in pristine conditions. And what happens after restoration? There are no data and no assessment either, as emission will highly depend on the type of restoration implemented. In addition to the need of investigating how peatland greenhouse gases emissions respond to reweighting and restoration, current scientific knowledge suggests that the IPCC emission factors could be improved based on different considerations. First, and for existing drain converted land use categories in Southeast Asia, by including new data published since 2013. For instance, the IPCC emission factors were based on very limited nitrous oxide flux data of low magnitude, while large emission rates have been recorded since then. Furthermore, a temporal variation of the emission factors could be considered. Indeed, process-based simulations of the CO2 on-site emission factor in oil palm plantations indicates that the decadal averages for the 10 to 20 years and 20 to 30 years after planting are substantially reduced as compared to the decadal average over the first decade after planting. These decadal averages are presented in green, blue, and orange in the figure, while the curve displays annual values. Another important point to consider is the inclusion of undrained degraded land use as a new category, since emissions in degraded lands that are undrained prove to be substantial. In Indonesia, we measured peat greenhouse gas fluxes in undrained primary and secondary forests and found peat greenhouse gas budgets one order of magnitude larger in secondary forests than in primary forests. Results showed that secondary forests emitted much higher rates of CO2, but also of nitrous oxide than primary forests. In the Peruvian Amazon, we looked at how unsustainable forest management affected peat greenhouse gas fluxes and found that the on-site CO2 uptakes were reduced by following medium degradation and turned into high emissions following high degradation. I would like to finalize my presentation with some conclusions regarding science. More peat greenhouse gas emission data are needed for the tropics. Notably, we need to conduct research to understand fluxes pre and post reweighting and restoration. And we also critically need more research outside of Southeast Asia. We need good quality data based on long-term experiments with high measurement frequency. And it's also crucial that IPCC methods are rigorously applied for developing emission factors. For instance, the CO2 on-site emission factor is the difference between the losses from heterotrophic respiration of the soil and carbon inputs through litterfall and roots. it's unfortunately extremely common that these inputs are ignored. In terms of science policy interface, there are plenty of opportunities for capacity building and collaboration between national MRV teams and scientists. Some examples include, for instance, an ongoing collaboration our projects have with the government of Indonesia for refining wetlands emission factors. And another example is the work conducted with the Peruvian government for including peatlands in the forest reference emission label. Cross-country collaboration is also an opportunity not to be missed. For example, the experience of the Indonesian MRV team could highly benefit other peat-rich countries like Peru or DRC, aiming at including peatlands in their national climate change strategies. With this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christelle, for your clear presentation with regard to emission factors, especially in degraded peatland, both in Indonesia and Peru. Ladies and gentlemen, the difference between peatland degradation in Indonesia and Peru is quite distinct, because in many cases in Indonesia it is degraded because of the drainage following deforestation, but in Peru there is no drainage kind of practices implemented on the ground. So you can see the difference in terms of emission factors. Another interesting thing that is revealed here and badly needed by the policy community is the non-CO2 gases is also revealed in this degraded peatland in two countries, in two different ecosystems. So I wonder if Mr. Gabriel Guihandra is joining. No? So I would like to invite our panel members to sit in front of the pavilion to entertain questions and from the audience. Thornstein, please take your seat. Pak Medril, Waruni, JJ, please wear your nice hat. For those who are participating online, please raise your question in the Q&A box so that we can read it for the panel member here in the pavilion. So we have a whole set of issues around carbon-rich peatland, which is seen from different perspectives, science and policy, but also from the donors. They have a lot of expectation and a portfolio which is trying to align with what is the challenge on the ground. So while we are waiting, here we go. We have plenty of questions for you, gentlemen and ladies. The first one is about this topic related to policy and how this policy has been adopting science, coming from the audience about the continuous process. We hear from Indonesia about this 2045 plan. I believe, and this question is also addressing that concern, along the way, the policy should be also subject to change in terms of, accommodating new information from science. Perhaps this question is addressed to Medril and also JJ. How do you accommodate this kind of concern along the line when you are implementing or even formulating the policy? You have new information like what we just heard today. Pak Medril, I offer to you.
Thank you very much, Pa Daniel, for the questions. And I think this is a very good questions. And of course, we as a government, we are very aware about the dynamics of the data and informations produced by the science. And with regards to our policy development scenario up to 2045, of course, uh, we 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 rely upon science in this case. And as you might be aware, that when we develop our low carbon development scenario, we relies upon the scientific informations that provided to us. And of course, we as a government and also as a think tank of the government, our office, Ministry of National Development Planning, basically do some kind of modeling as well. And we develop policy scenario based on the systems modeling, and we apply this very good informations that we collect from the scientific exercise. For examples like the emission factors from the peatlands, and of course the socio factors as well affecting the peatlands pressures, and also the economic context as well. So the very integrative aspects that we have already conducted, then we try to incorporate all those
Yeah.
aspects into our policy development scenario. And of course, because this is very dynamics, and we keep evaluates we keep evaluating the policy scenario performance based on the current
Information.
current informations that
Thank
we
you.
have.
Before I give the floor to JJ, there is a follow-up question with that regard. How do you accommodate the grassroots level kind of information
Yes.
in addition to science in this process
Yeah.
of policy making?
Yeah. When we develop our policy scenario, this is not just a scenario coming from the top. We have to collaborate, and we have to consider the bottom-up approach as well. So that's why when we develop our systems modeling, we also really rely upon the informations and also the storytelling that provided by the bottom-up as well.
Okay.
So we really expect that the grassroots informations that we can also collect the grassroots information, so then it can enrich our understanding on what happened actually on the field. So then that could be accommodated into our policy development scenario.
And I believe you have the mechanism for that
Yes,
kind
of
of
course.
dialogue. Yes.
Yeah.
JJ?
Comment accommoder la politique nationale de tourbière à la donne ou aux données scientifiques? Nous, en République démocratique du Congo, nous avons choisi de pouvoir identifier une politique nationale des tourbières qui part de deux volets. Le premier volet, ce sont les consultations. Il s'agit essentiellement des consultations des parties prenantes, non seulement au niveau national, mais aussi à l'international. Par exemple, nous pouvons contacter les collègues de l'Indonésie et savoir un peu qu'est-ce qu'ils ont déjà fait sur la politique des tourbières. Ça, c'est le premier aspect. Le deuxième aspect qui est très important pour nous, c'est de pouvoir connecter la politique à l'aspect scientifique. Donc, à ce stade, nous ne pouvons pas identifier ou définir une politique nationale de tourbières si nous n'avons pas des informations qui nous viennent des scientifiques. C'est pour cela que nous accordons une place très importante à la recherche. Et lorsque nous disons recherche, il ne s'agit pas pour nous uniquement de la cartographie ou de l'inventaire des tourbières. La recherche va un peu plus loin. J'ai aimé une expression qui a été utilisée par notre collègue qui a dit il faut connecter l'aspect des tourbières, il faut connecter la science et la technologie aux communautés ou bien à la population. Et donc, si avec les années, nous découvrons que la science nous donne d'autres informations par rapport à celles que nous avions au début, nous allons nous asseoir pour pouvoir réévaluer notre politique. Par exemple, si on nous dit à travers des études que les menaces qui étaient celles que nous connaissions qui pesaient sur les tourbières, ces menaces ont changé, il va falloir maintenant se rasseoir et réidentifier une nouvelle politique. Et donc, nous gardons cette ouverture d'esprit de pouvoir tirer profit des leçons qui vont nous venir de la science. C'est pour ça qu'en ce moment, nous accordons une place très importante à l'identification des études qui devront éclairer cette politique-là. Voilà ce que je peux dire à ce stade. Merci.
Thank you very much, JJ. Thorsten, do you have any comment on this dialogue process, both science and policy and grassroots level?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, it was slightly mentioned already. I think what is pretty important when designing programs, also large-scale programs, that it sometimes it tends to happen that, of course, there is an inclusion of science into the program design phase, for example, but that might, and I'm more looking now more from the implementing agency point of view, but that is perhaps then incorporated at the beginning of the project. And what sometimes is missing, and we have seen examples here where it is actually not missing, so that's the good news, is that it is going to be a successful dialogue and a successful integration of scientific research into policy when there is a continuous dialogue. So not like a once in a project design phase that is happening. And because what I think is important when it comes to better understand what science is telling, that you only will be able to adjust your programs when you have this kind of continuity in this exchange. And I think this is something I just could add from a donor perspective, that when programs are designed, it's fundamentally important to have this kind of continuity within the entire implementation and even beyond when it comes to this kind of policy dialogues together with scientists.
Thank you, Thorsten. Noel, you are online. Do you have any comment with regard to the 3 pillars that you offer today? Is there any possibility of, I don't know what you call it, pitfall or lack of, information or communication between the stakeholders?
Was that directed to me, Daniel?
The 3 pillars you mentioned earlier about science, policy, and practitioner, how they can interact, or at least the information from scientific community. Is there any challenge with regard to communicating result, and what is your expectation if you can improve that?
Yeah, that's a big question. What was on my mind as I was listening to the dialogue just now about the challenge at the grassroots, as I was thinking and incorporating research information, research findings, I was thinking a little bit about what we mean by grassroots in this particular context. And I was thinking about the importance of ownership of information and ownership of findings. And I think that this maybe goes to your question about the links between research and practice and policy, and needing to be careful. I think Thorsten spoke to this a little bit too, that it can't be a one-way exchange, a one-way provision of information. And there's a variety of challenges that come up if you try to go that route. And one is that you provide information to a partner who doesn't particularly understand how it was derived, your partner might not understand how to update it. They might not have the capacity to interpret it particularly well or apply it in different contexts. And part of what that means in choosing what research we do is that we often, the more we can actually partner with the institutions, the individuals who will be using that information actually in designing the research and generating the information in the first place, so that there's really full ownership and ability to interpret, ability to continue to do that research, even if some of the research scientists involved change out a bit. You get a much more sustainable result, even if sometimes you sacrifice the most precise information you can provide or the most advanced technology that you could use.
Thank you. Science never perfect. We are allowed to make mistake, and that's what the uncertainties is all about. But we eager to improve, I guess, the uncertainties. Now let's move to science, as Noel alluded at that issue is very straightforward questions to Haruni and Christelle. Haruni, what is the difference between pyrogenic carbon and the normal carbon? Is it something special with regard to fire?
Thank you, Pak Daniel, for the question. I think, yes, I think this is a new knowledge that we could find on the ground when we are conducting the field study to see the impact of fire on the loss of carbons. And we could see so many, so many carbons available, still left on the ground, even in the site has been burned several years ago. The pyrogenic carbon we call here is kind of like what we call it. Yeah, we can consider this as a new pool, in addition to dead woods, woody debris we still left on the ground. But if it is after burning, you will see so many pyrogenic carbon still left on the ground. So we would like to introduce this. In addition to the 5 carbon pools that we already learned and from the ITPC guidelines, but for the impact of fire on the carbon pools that still are on the ground, this is something new and also important. And we our study found that about 12% actually the carbons on the above ground is still it's
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Christel, you have very tough questions. I think this is from Sarawak, Malaysia, where there is an oil palm plantation in peatland, and they call it sustainable oil palm on peatland. Do you have any comment about it with regard to emission and emission factor when in this kind of practice? In 2 minutes.
Sorry, is it sustainable oil palm cultivation on peat?
Yes.
I don't think any kind of cultivation on peat can be sustainable unless this is rewetted. And this is the reason why we shouldn't use peatlands for agriculture, because these ecosystems have slowly accumulated carbon over thousands of years. But once we convert them, we drain them, they become carbon bombs, really.
Right.
And so there is no way of cultivating on peatlands with drainage. There are other ways which are called paludiculture, but this needs to be developed very specifically using local species and really making the greenhouse gas measurements rigorously to check whether it's really sustainable or not.
Thank you very much, Christel. Very straightforward answer, and thank you very much to all speakers and panel member here for your contribution in this very interesting session on carbon-rich peatland, how we manage that. Suddenly we learn new numbers, new information here with regard to science and also how we can induce that kind of new information in the policy processes. Thank you very much and appreciate your participation.